The Scorpion's Sting, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Chapter 1. The Desert Party. It was the heat that struck me first, Hastings. Not the familiar, dry heat of London, but a thick, suffocating blanket of desert sun, pressing down on the sands of Giza like a physical weight. The very air shimmered above the ancient stones, and the pyramids, those silent giants, seemed to watch with an indifference only millennia can grant. We had arrived at Professor Percival Abernathy's archaeological dig site, a temporary oasis of canvas tents and buzzing activity nestled against the colossal shadow of Khufu for the unveiling of his life's work. The air crackled with a different kind of heat, the nervous, glittering excitement of international scholars, museum directors and journalists, all gathered under the vast, indifferent sky. Poirot, ever the picture of meticulous order amidst the desert chaos, adjusted his immaculate grey waistcoat and surveyed the scene with his customary, almost critical eye. "Ah, mon ami," he murmured, his voice barely rising above the hum of conversation and the distant drone of a generator. "It is like a miniature London society, transplanted into the Sahara. All the glitter, all the pretensions and the constant fear that one's sandal might slip on the very foundation of one's reputation." We were met by Abernathy himself, a man whose flamboyant white linen suit seemed to absorb the desert glare, his face flushed with anticipation rather than the sun. He was a force of nature, a man who spoke in booming pronouncements and gestured grandly with hands that bore the permanent ink stains of his trade. "Poirot, Hastings, you honour us. The great moment approaches," he boomed, clapping Poirot on the shoulder with a force that made my friend wince slightly. "The world will see what I have uncovered, a true treasure buried for centuries." He ushered us towards the central tent, a magnificent structure straining under the weight of expectation. Inside, the air was thick with cigar smoke, expensive perfume, and the low thrum of hushed conversation. A long table, draped in white linen, dominated the space. On it, beneath a glass bell jar that caught the harsh sunlight filtering through the tent flaps, rested the object of all this fervour, a small statuette of a deity crafted from a strange, dark stone, its surface covered in intricate hieroglyphs. Beside it lay a fragile fragment of papyrus, yellowed with age but bearing clear, precise script. "The key," Abernathy declared, his voice trembling with emotion. "Not just to this particular tomb, my tomb, but to the very heart of the Old Kingdom's religious practice. A revelation that will rewrite history." He beamed around the room, his gaze sweeping over faces that were either rapturous or subtly envious. Among them, I noticed a young man standing slightly apart near a stack of crates, Dr. Felix Marlowe, Abernathy's principal assistant. He was tall, lean, with dark hair falling across his forehead and eyes that held a deep, watchful intensity. His gaze, however, was fixed not on the statuette, but on Abernathy himself, a flicker of something unreadable, perhaps resentment, perhaps profound anxiety, crossing his features before he quickly masked it. The atmosphere was thick with professional jealousy and the unspoken rivalry that festers in academic circles. Lady Winthrop, a formidable lady from the British Museum, murmured to a colleague about unsubstantiated claims and premature announcements. A young German scholar, Dr. Vogel, kept glancing nervously at Marlowe. The air hummed with the tension of the unspoken. Would this discovery be Abernathy's crowning glory, or would it merely be the foundation for someone else's career? Poirot, however, seemed utterly unfazed by the grandeur or the tension. He moved with his usual unhurried grace, observing the guests, the arrangement of the tent, the very pattern of the sand on the floor near the table. His little grey cells, I knew, were already whirring, cataloguing impressions that would later prove vital. "A fascinating spectacle, mon ami," he said to me, his voice low. "But beneath the glittering surface there is a current. A very strong current. One that might, perhaps, cause a sudden and unpleasant ripple." I looked at him, puzzled. Ripple? In this desert heat, Poirot? He merely smiled that small, enigmatic smile of his. "The desert is full of hidden currents, Hastings, and sometimes the most dangerous ones are not made of sand." Chapter 2. The Tension Beneath the Sand. The following day, as the sun beat down mercilessly, the true nature of the current began to reveal itself, not in grand pronouncements, but in the subtle, almost imperceptible shifts of the dig team. The camaraderie of the previous evening had vanished, replaced by a brittle silence punctuated by furtive glances and hurried conversations that ceased abruptly when others approached. The camp was a hive of activity, men in dusty overalls brushing sand from artifacts, women carefully documenting finds, the constant thump of a hammer on stone. Yet, beneath the surface, an undercurrent of tension pulsed. I saw Dr. Vogel deliberately avoid Marlowe near the water cooler, turning his back as the young assistant approached. A heated exchange between Abernathy and a senior Egyptian archaeologist, Mustafa, was overheard in hushed, angry tones near the generator, something about proper procedure and unauthorized access. The local foreman, a man named Kamal, seemed unusually anxious, constantly checking his watch and glancing towards the tent where the statuette was kept. Poirot, as ever, was the quiet observer. He spent hours sitting near the edge of the camp, sketching in a small notebook, his gaze fixed on the people moving about. It was during one such session, as he carefully noted the angle of a shadow cast by a tent pole, that I noticed him pause. His eyes had locked onto Marlowe. The young assistant was standing near the central tent, ostensibly checking the sand around the foundation stones. But his posture was rigid, his gaze fixed intently on Abernathy, who was walking towards the main excavation trench with a group of students. It wasn't just observation, it was an intensity that bordered on obsession. Marlowe's hand, resting on a small leather satchel at his side, tightened almost imperceptibly as Abernathy spoke loudly, gesturing towards a newly uncovered section of wall. "Look at him, Hastings," Poirot murmured, his voice barely audible over the desert wind. "He watches the professor like a hawk, watches a mouse. But it is not admiration. It is calculation, or perhaps désespoir." "Calculation?" I whispered back, glancing towards Marlowe. "What do you mean?" Poirot's gaze remained fixed on the young man. The mind that calculates a crime is often the mind that sees the flaw in the perfect plan first, or, as in this case, believes it has been stolen from them. He sighed softly, a sound of weary understanding. The professional jealousy here is not merely academic, mon ami. It is a deep, cold wound, and wounds like that, they sometimes bleed. Later, I tried to casually question Marlowe about the sand patterns near the trench. He answered politely enough, but his eyes darted away, and he spoke with a slight tremor in his voice. "Just doing my duty, Hastings. The sand shifts easily here, especially after the wind yesterday. We need to be meticulous." When I asked if he'd seen anything unusual the night before, his answer was too quick, too rehearsed. No, nothing out of the ordinary. Just the usual excitement of the unveiling. His evasion, combined with Poirot's observation, planted a seed of suspicion in my mind. What wound could be so deep that it would drive a man to commit murder? The question lingered, heavy as the desert heat. Chapter 3. The Great Reveal. The night of the unveiling arrived with a finality that seemed to press down on the entire camp. The tent was transformed. Candles flickered in ornate holders, casting dancing shadows on the faces of the gathered elite. The air buzzed with anticipation. The clink of glasses filled with chilled white wine, the low murmur of excited conversation, the rustle of expensive fabrics. The glass bell jar sat once more on the central table, bathed in the soft light of a single spotlight. Professor Abernathy stood before it, his face alight with triumph. He was dressed not in his usual work clothes, but in a crisp, dark suit, a stark contrast to the desert surroundings. He held a small, velvet-covered box. "Friends, colleagues," he began, his voice resonating with the weight of the moment, "for decades we have searched for the key to understanding the rituals surrounding the Osirian cults of the Third Dynasty. We have found only fragments, hints, whispers in the sand. But this," he lifted the velvet cover with a flourish, "this is the key. The statuette, known as the Whisperer of Sekhmet, bearing inscriptions that directly link the ritual to the specific celestial alignments observed on the day of the solstice. And this fragment of papyrus," he held up the delicate piece, "contains the actual ritual text, the words spoken by the high priest himself." He paused for dramatic effect, the silence in the tent thick enough to taste. The guests leaned forward, eyes wide with awe. A ripple of applause began, growing into a full, enthusiastic wave. Glasses were raised. Champagne corks popped like celebratory gunfire. Abernathy beamed, basking in the adulation. "This," he declared, raising his glass high, "is not merely a discovery. It is my discovery, the culmination of my life's work." As the applause subsided, Abernathy turned to gesture towards the tent entrance, perhaps to acknowledge the Egyptian team, or simply to savour the moment. That was when Poirot's eyes narrowed. For a fraction of a second, the young assistant, Dr. Felix Marlowe, who had been standing near the back of the tent, stepped forward slightly, his expression shifting from the polite detachment he'd maintained to something far more intense, a look of fierce concentration, almost predatory. Poirot's hand, resting on the table, tightened almost imperceptibly. His gaze, sharp as a scalpel, swept across the room. He noted the position of every guest, the angle of the spotlight, the precise way Abernathy held his glass. It was all part of the scene, the perfect stage for the drama that was about to unfold. The moment passed, and Abernathy turned back towards the table, raising his glass again. "To the past, to the future," he cried. Poirot watched him, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. "Ah," he seemed to think, "the stage is set. Now, what will the play be?" His little grey cells were already working, assembling the pieces of a puzzle that would soon reveal a very different kind of tragedy. Chapter 4. A Sudden Collapse. The celebratory supper was a whirlwind of clinking glasses and animated conversation. Abernathy, flushed with success and champagne, was in his element, regaling the guests with stories of the dig's most dramatic moments. Marlowe, however, seemed withdrawn, barely touching his food, his gaze fixed on a point just beyond the tent. Then, abruptly, it happened. Abernathy raised his glass for a third toast. "To the enduring mystery of Egypt," when he suddenly gasped. It wasn't a loud cry, but a sharp, choked intake of breath. His hand flew to his left forearm, just below the elbow. He stumbled back against the table, knocking over his glass. Wine spilled across the white linen. "Professor Abernathy," Lady Winthrop cried out, rising from her seat. "Are you ill?" He tried to speak, but only a strangled sound emerged. His face contorted in agony. He clutched his arm tighter, his knuckles white, and then, with a final, shuddering gasp, he slumped sideways, his head hitting the edge of the table with a soft thud. He lay motionless. Panic, cold and sharp, sliced through the room. Someone screamed. Glasses were knocked over. The orderly buzz of conversation shattered into chaos. Then, a voice cut through the din, loud and panicked. "A scorpion! He's been stung!" The words hung in the air like a curse. A collective gasp followed. People began pointing towards the floor near Abernathy's feet. Someone had spotted it. A small, dark, spiny creature, its tail curled in what looked like a defensive posture, half hidden under the table. "Scorpion!" the voice repeated, louder now. "He was stung by a scorpion!" Abernathy's body lay still, his face pale beneath the desert sun. The champagne on the table glistened, reflecting the candlelight. Poirot, who had risen slowly from his chair at the first sign of trouble, stood perfectly still for a moment, his gaze fixed on Abernathy's lifeless form, then flickering to the creature on the sand. His expression was one of profound calm, utterly devoid of panic. He didn't rush to the body, he simply observed. Hastings, my heart hammering against my ribs, rushed towards Abernathy, but Poirot's hand, light as a feather, rested on my arm. "Wait, mon ami," he murmured, his voice low and steady. "Let us observe first." The room was a scene of utter pandemonium. Guests were shouting, some crying, others trying to help, while a few began frantically searching for the creature that had supposedly caused the death. The local doctor, Dr. Hassan, who had been present at the event, hurried over. He knelt beside Abernathy, felt for a pulse, then shook his head gravely. "It is very bad," he said, his voice thick with concern. "He has suffered a scorpion sting. The venom. It is fast-acting. He is gone." He gestured towards the creature on the sand. "See? It was hiding under the table. It must have been disturbed during the commotion. A terrible accident." A collective sigh of relief seemed to ripple through the room. The immediate horror of a sudden death was replaced by the grim certainty of an unfortunate, albeit natural, end. The mystery, it seemed, was solved. Poirot, however, remained utterly still. His eyes, sharp as flint, were fixed on the body, on the spot where Abernathy had fallen, on the position of his hand, on the lack of sand on his clothing, despite the fact that he had been standing near a sandy floor for hours. He saw the way the wine-glass lay, knocked over but not spilled, and the faint, almost invisible smear of something dark on the edge of the table. No, Poirot thought, this is not how a scorpion sting happens. This is not the end of a man who has been stung by a scorpion. This is something else entirely, a carefully arranged stage, a deliberate act. He turned his gaze to the creature on the sand. It looked perfectly ordinary, but Poirot's little grey cells, already whirring at full speed, noted its position. It had been placed under the table. Not stumbled there by accident, placed deliberately. Chapter 5. The First Hypotheses. The immediate panic subsided into a tense, heavy silence as Dr. Hassan confirmed Abernathy's death and pronounced the cause, a scorpion sting. Inspector Japp, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with the weary burden of his profession, arrived on the scene within minutes, his presence a steadying force amidst the chaos. He took charge with calm efficiency, directing his men to secure the tent and the surrounding area. "Right then," Japp said, his voice cutting through the murmur. "We need to establish the sequence of events. Who was where? Who saw what?" He began questioning the guests, his manner brisk but respectful. The answers were a jumble of confusion and self-preservation. Lady Winthrop claimed she had been talking to Dr. Vogel at the far end of the table when the incident occurred. Dr. Vogel, however, insisted he had been observing the statuette near the front. Two other guests corroborated that they had seen Abernathy raise his glass moments before collapsing. Poirot, meanwhile, was not questioning anyone. He was observing. He knelt beside the body, his posture elegant despite the grim circumstances. He examined the wound on Abernathy's forearm, a small puncture mark barely visible beneath the sleeve of his white suit. His fingers, gloved in white cotton, traced the edges with infinite care. "Inspector," Poirot said, his voice calm, "may I see the body more closely, and the location where the scorpion was found?" Japp, used to Poirot's eccentricities, nodded. "Of course, Poirot. We'll have it secured." Poirot turned his attention to the wound. He noted the precise angle of the puncture, not the typical downward angle a scorpion sting would take if it had been crawling up the arm. It looked almost deliberate. He lifted Abernathy's sleeve slightly, revealing a small patch of skin just above the puncture. "Look here," he murmured to Japp, his voice barely above a whisper. "The skin is not bruised. There is no sign of a struggle. The puncture itself is too clean, too. Precise." He then moved to the spot where the scorpion had been found. He knelt, his eyes scanning the sand with microscopic attention. "See?" he said, pointing to a tiny patch of disturbed sand near the creature. "This sand has been moved, not by wind, but by a hand, or perhaps a small object." He picked up a piece of sand between his gloved fingers. "And this sand, it is not the same as the sand on the floor here. It is finer, drier, as if it had been placed here, not naturally occurring." He turned to the table where Abernathy had been sitting. He noted the position of the glass, knocked over, but the wine inside was still relatively undisturbed, suggesting it hadn't been knocked over in a violent struggle. "The glass was knocked over before he fell," Poirot observed, his voice calm. "He was holding it when he gasped. The fall was sudden, not preceded by a struggle." Japp frowned. "But the doctor said scorpion sting. That seems straightforward enough." Poirot's eyes met Japp's. "The doctor is a good man," Poirot said gently, "but he has seen many scorpion stings. He has assumed the cause without examining the circumstances. The position of the wound, the lack of sand on the body, the unnatural placement of the creature. These are not the marks of a natural accident." He turned to Hastings, who had been standing by, watching Poirot's meticulous observations. "Hastings," he said quietly, "the little grey cells are working. This is not a scorpion sting. It is murder. And the murderer has left a very clever, very theatrical misdirection." Japp looked at Poirot, his expression shifting from scepticism to wary interest. "You think it was planned? "Planned, Inspector," Poirot said, his voice firm. "And, very carefully, the scorpion is a red herring. A very convincing one, I must admit. But the real weapon is hidden, and the murderer has already begun to weave a story around it." Chapter 6. The Dead Scorpion. The local authorities, eager to close the case as swiftly as possible, had already collected the scorpion and placed it in a small glass vial for examination. It was a common desert species, Androctonus australis, known for its potent venom. The local police officer who had found it declared it the cause of death, his voice full of finality. Poirot, however, was not satisfied. He requested to see the scorpion and the vial. Japp, intrigued by Poirot's insistence, allowed it. The vial was handed over, and Poirot took it carefully, holding it up to the light. He examined the creature with a magnifying glass he produced from his pocket. "Ah," he murmured, "this is interesting." He turned to Japp and Hastings. "Inspector, you see this scorpion? It is indeed Androctonus australis, a common species in this region. However," he pointed to the creature's tail, "the telson, the stinger, is not fully extended. It is slightly curled, as if it was placed there deliberately. In a natural sting, the telson would be fully deployed." He then turned his attention to the vial itself. "And look at this, the sand inside the vial. It is not the same as the sand on the floor of the tent. It is finer, drier. As I suspected earlier, it was placed here, not naturally occurring." Poirot then turned to the cloak that had been draped over Abernathy's chair. It was a light, linen affair, now stained with wine and something else, a faint, dark smudge near the hem. Poirot carefully examined it under the light. "See here," he said, pointing to a small, almost invisible mark on the fabric. "A tiny piece of sand, but it is not the same as the sand on the floor. It is a different color, a different texture. It was placed here." He looked up, his eyes sharp. The scorpion was not found on Abernathy. It was placed under the table, near where he fell. The murderer knew exactly where to place it to create the illusion of an accidental sting. But the sand on the cloak, it is a clue. It was planted after the body was moved. He turned to Japp. "Inspector, this scorpion was brought here, placed deliberately. It was not part of the natural environment. It was a prop, and the murderer wanted it to be found here to divert suspicion from the real cause of death." Japp frowned. "But how could they know where to place it? How could they have known Abernathy would collapse there?" Poirot's lips curved into a faint smile. "Because, Inspector, they knew he would collapse there. They had planned for it. The scorpion was merely a stage prop." Chapter 7. Alibis and Small Lies. The following day, the camp was transformed into a police precinct. Japp, with Poirot's assistance, began to meticulously gather alibis and sift through the web of motives that had been simmering beneath the surface. The guests were questioned one by one. Lady Winthrop, the formidable museum representative, was the first. She claimed she had been deep in conversation with Dr. Vogel about the potential implications of the discovery for the British Museum's collection when Abernathy collapsed. "I barely saw him fall," she insisted, her voice cool and composed. Dr. Vogel can confirm. Dr. Vogel, however, seemed nervous. He stammered, "Well, yes, we were discussing the papyrus fragment, but I didn't see anything. I was focused on the text." Hastings noted the contradiction. Vogel had been near the front of the tent, while Abernathy had been at the table. It was unlikely he would have seen the collapse from that position unless he had moved. The Egyptian team members were next. Mustafa, the senior archaeologist, claimed he had been checking the sand patterns near the trench entrance when the incident occurred. "I heard the commotion," he said, his voice tense, "but I was too far away to see anything clearly." Kamal, the local foreman, insisted he had been in the water tent, filling bottles. Poirot, however, was not interested in their alibis alone. He began to probe deeper, asking about relationships, rivalries, and past incidents. "Dr. Marlowe," Poirot said gently, addressing the young assistant as they sat in a quiet corner of the camp. "You were very close to Professor Abernathy. You worked together for many years. What was your relationship like?" Marlowe's eyes flickered away. "We had a good working relationship, Monsieur Poirot." "He was a great mentor." "Was he?" Poirot asked softly, his gaze steady. "And what about the discovery? The statuette and the papyrus fragment. You were the one who uncovered the inscription on the statuette, was it not? Marlowe's face tightened. I helped with the initial documentation, he said, his voice tight. But Professor Abernathy was the lead researcher. Of course, Poirot murmured. And you were very excited about the unveiling. You looked very focused on him during the toast. Marlowe shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Oh, I was just observing. It was a big moment for him. Poirot nodded slowly. Yes it was. But do you think he might have taken credit for something that belonged to you? Marlowe's eyes widened slightly. What? No, that's absurd. The professor was very generous with his team. Poirot didn't press further. He simply noted the evasiveness, the way Marlowe's hand trembled slightly as he adjusted his cufflink, a small silver thing shaped like a tiny pyramid. Later, Hastings interviewed some of the other staff. The cook, a woman named Fatima, who had been serving food during the supper, recalled seeing Marlowe near the tent entrance just before the incident. He was talking to someone, she said, frowning. A man in a dark suit. I didn't recognize him. Hastings pressed further, but Fatima couldn't recall the man's face. Just a tall man. Dark suit. He looked very nervous. Hastings also noticed something odd. A small, almost invisible smear of adhesive on Abernathy's sleeve near the puncture wound. It matched the type used by conservators to secure fragile artifacts. But why would there be adhesive on the professor's sleeve? The alibis were shaky, the contradictions numerous, and Marlowe's evasiveness was palpable. The motives. Professional jealousy, the fear of being overshadowed, the hunger for recognition, began to form a clear picture in Hastings' mind. And Poirot's little grey cells, working tirelessly, were connecting the dots. Chapter 8. The Post-Mortem. The medical examiner, a man named Dr. Ellis from Cairo, arrived later that day. He conducted a post-mortem examination on Abernathy's body and presented his findings to Japp and Poirot in a small, sterile tent set up for the purpose. The cause of death, Dr. Ellis began, adjusting his spectacles, is unequivocal. Neurotoxic venom, consistent with the sting of Androctonus australis, the desert scorpion. He paused, looking at Poirot. However, he cleared his throat. The wound itself. It is not typical. The puncture is too clean, too precise. There's no sign of swelling or bruising that would normally accompany a scorpion sting. And there is no stinger lodged in the wound. He placed a small, magnified photograph on the table. See here? The wound is barely visible. It was likely delivered with a very fine instrument, not by a scorpion's stinger. Poirot leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the photograph. Ah, he said softly. So, the scorpion sting. It was a false sting. The venom was delivered another way. Dr. Ellis nodded. Precisely. The venom could have been administered via a hypodermic needle or some other fine instrument. The puncture would be small, clean, and the wound would heal quickly with no external signs, except for the venom itself. He pulled out another sheet of paper. The medical report also notes that the venom was delivered very rapidly, almost immediately. A scorpion sting would take a few minutes to cause such a severe reaction. Poirot's eyes narrowed. So the scorpion sting was a misdirection. The real cause was the injection of neurotoxin. Dr. Ellis nodded again. Exactly. The murderer wanted it to look like a natural scorpion sting. They used the venom, but they delivered it with a device that left no trace of the stinger. Poirot turned to Japp. Inspector, this is crucial. The murderer did not use a scorpion to sting him. They used the scorpion as a prop, to create the illusion of an accident. Japp frowned. But how? How could they deliver the venom without anyone noticing? Poirot's gaze was steady. They had to have a way to inject the venom without being seen. And they had to make it look like the scorpion was the cause. The scorpion was placed after the injection to cover up the real weapon. He turned back to the medical report. And the missing fragment of papyrus. That's not just a coincidence. It was part of the motive. Someone wanted Abernathy silenced before he could claim full credit for the discovery. Japp looked at Poirot, his eyes wide with dawning realization. You think the murder was about the discovery? About who gets the credit? Poirot nodded. Yes, Inspector. The most human of motives. Wounded pride, professional jealousy, the hunger for recognition. and it drove someone to commit murder. Chapter 9. The Missing Fragment. The next morning, while Poirot and Japp were reviewing the evidence in a quiet corner of the camp, Hastings entered, holding a small, folded piece of papyrus. "Look at this," he said, his voice tight with excitement. "I found it under Abernathy's chair. It was a fragment of papyrus, identical to the one that had been displayed the night before, but it was missing a crucial section, a few lines of text that had been clearly part of the ritual description." Poirot took it gently, his fingers tracing the edges. "Ah," he said softly, "this is the missing fragment." He turned to Japp. "Inspector, this fragment was not just missing, it was taken. And it was taken before the unveiling." He held up the fragment. "See how the edges are clean. It wasn't torn off. It was carefully removed. Someone wanted to ensure that Abernathy could not publish the full text of the ritual. The full text would have revealed who had actually made the discovery, not Abernathy, but someone else." Hastings looked at Poirot, his mind racing. "You mean Marlowe? He was the one who found the inscription on the statuette. If the full text was published, it would show that he had the key insight." Poirot nodded slowly. "Exactly. The missing fragment was the crucial piece. Without it, Abernathy's claim that he had uncovered the ritual text is incomplete. It would have been an embarrassment for him, a sign that he had not fully understood the discovery, and it would have revealed that Marlowe had discovered the key part." He turned to Japp. "The motive is clear now, Inspector. Marlowe believed that Abernathy had stolen his work, that he had taken credit for something that was his. And when Abernathy announced the discovery with full credit, Marlowe saw only one way to stop him: silence him." Japp's expression shifted from confusion to grim understanding. "So he planned this murder. He used the scorpion as a misdirection to make it look like an accident. But he killed him because he believed his work had been stolen." Poirot nodded. "Yes, Inspector. The hunger for recognition is a powerful force. It can drive even the most reasonable person to commit a terrible act. And Marlowe's belief that his work had been stolen was not merely a suspicion. It was a conviction." As he said this, Poirot glanced towards the tent where Marlowe was working, a small, almost imperceptible flicker of sadness in his eyes. "The ruinous hunger for recognition," he thought. "It can destroy everything." Chapter 10. The Small, Overlooked Things. Poirot spent the next day meticulously examining every detail of the scene. He moved through the tent with the precision of a surgeon, his eyes missing nothing. He found it first on Abernathy's sleeve, the small smear of adhesive, the same type used by conservators to secure fragile artifacts. It was barely visible, a tiny, almost invisible mark near the puncture wound. But Poirot saw it. He noted that the adhesive was still slightly tacky, as if it had been applied recently. Then he found the footprint. Not a large one, but a small, precise impression in the sand near the table where Abernathy had been standing. It was the size of a man's shoe, but the heel was slightly worn on the left side. Poirot made a careful sketch of it. He also found a single cufflink, a small silver pyramid, lying under the table near where the scorpion had been found. It was not Abernathy's. It was too small, too delicate. Poirot picked it up and held it to the light. "Look at this, Hastings," he said quietly. "This cufflink is made of silver, not gold, and it is shaped like a pyramid, a very specific shape." Hastings looked at him, confused. "So, it's a cufflink?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Yes, but it is not the kind of cufflink a man like Abernathy would wear. He was a scholar. He wore simple, practical clothing. This cufflink, it is very expensive, very elegant, and it matches the description of the man Fatima saw near the tent entrance, a tall man in a dark suit." He turned to Japp. "Inspector, this cufflink is a clue. It was dropped by the murderer when he placed the scorpion under the table, the adhesive on Abernathy's sleeve. It was used to secure the device that delivered the venom, the footprint. It was made by the same person who wore the cufflink, and the missing fragment of papyrus. It was taken by the same person." He paused, his gaze fixed on the small, insignificant objects. Each one seemed so small, so unimportant. A smear of adhesive, a footprint, a cufflink. But together they form a picture. They tell a story, and that story is the truth. Hastings looked at Poirot, a new respect dawning in his eyes. The little grey cells, he thought. They see what others cannot. Chapter 11. The History of a Grudge. Poirot's search for evidence led him to Abernathy's personal study tent. Inside, amid stacks of notes, maps and photographs, he found what he was looking for, a series of letters and a small notebook. The letters were from Dr. Felix Marlowe. They were written over the past year, each one more tense than the last. Professor Abernathy, one letter read, "I have completed the translation of the inscription on the statuette. The key phrase you mentioned, the Whisperer of Sekhmet, is not just a title. It refers to a specific ritual involving the alignment of the stars. I believe this is the key to understanding the tomb's purpose. Please let me present this at the next meeting." Professor Abernathy, another letter read, "I have documented the entire process of the inscription's discovery. I believe it is crucial that my name be included in any publication. The work was mine, not yours. I have evidence to prove it." The final letter was dated only 2 days before the unveiling. "Professor Abernathy, I have found the missing fragment of the papyrus. It confirms everything I suspected. You have stolen my work. You have taken credit for something that was mine. I will not allow this to happen. You will not publish your discovery with full credit. I will make sure of it." Poirot read the words carefully, his expression grave. He then turned to the notebook, which contained Marlowe's notes on the inscription, the same text that had been missing from the fragment Abernathy had displayed. The entries were detailed, precise, the work of a scholar who knew exactly what he was doing. But the final entry was dated the night before the unveiling. "The plan is set. The scorpion will be placed under the table. The venom will be delivered just before the toast. He will collapse. It will look like an accident. No one will suspect. I have been wronged. Now I will be right." Poirot closed the notebook slowly. "Ah," he murmured, "the motive is confirmed." He then spoke to the witnesses who had seen Marlowe and Abernathy arguing 2 nights before the unveiling. Mustafa, the senior Egyptian archaeologist, recalled a heated exchange near the main excavation trench. "I heard them shouting," Mustafa said, his voice low. Abernathy was angry. He said, "You think you deserve credit for my work? You were an assistant, not a professor." Marlowe was furious. He said, "You stole it. You took what was mine." They were shouting so loudly that the entire camp could hear them. The cook, Fatima, also confirmed seeing Marlowe arguing with Abernathy near the tent entrance 2 nights before. "He was very upset," she said. He kept saying, "You took my discovery. You stole it from me." Abernathy just laughed and walked away. Poirot listened to the testimony, his expression unreadable. The motive was clear, a deep, bitter resentment, a belief that Marlowe's work had been stolen and his reputation ruined. And in that moment of rage and betrayal, he had decided to kill Abernathy, not just to stop him from publishing, but to take back what he believed was rightfully his. Chapter 12. Rehearsal of the Crime. Poirot called a meeting with Japp, Hastings, and the key members of the dig team in the main tent. He had asked them all to gather around the table where Abernathy had been sitting the night of the unveiling. "Sit here," Poirot instructed, gesturing to various chairs around the table. "We will reconstruct the events of the evening." He placed a small empty glass in the spot where Abernathy had been sitting. He then indicated the position of the scorpion, under the table, near the leg. "Now," he said, his voice calm and precise, "Professor Abernathy was standing here." He pointed to the spot beside the table. He raised his glass for the toast. He turned to Japp. "Inspector, you were seated here," he said, indicating a chair near the front of the tent. Japp nodded. "Yes, I was at the head of the table." Poirot then walked to the tent entrance. "Dr. Marlowe was standing here near the entrance," he said. "He was waiting for the moment." He turned back towards the table. He approached Abernathy from behind just as he raised his glass. He would have been close enough to deliver the venom, perhaps using a device hidden in his hand or in a small object he was holding. Poirot paused, then walked to the spot where the scorpion had been found. He placed the scorpion here, under the table, just before Abernathy collapsed. He knew exactly where to place it to create the illusion of an accidental sting. He turned to the group. The murder was not accidental, was planned. The scorpion was a misdirection, The real weapon was the venom, delivered with a fine instrument, a hypodermic needle, perhaps disguised as a small object. He pointed to the spot where Abernathy had been standing. The puncture wound was clean, precise. It was not caused by a scorpion. It was caused by the injection of venom. Poirot turned to Japp. "Inspector, the position of the body, the placement of the scorpion, the timing, all point to a deliberate act. The murderer knew exactly what he was doing. He wanted it to look like an accident, and for a while, it did." He looked around the table, his gaze steady. "The little grey cells," he said softly, "they see the truth behind the illusion, and in this case the illusion was very convincing." Chapter 13. The Little Grey Cells Strike. Poirot summoned Marlowe to the tent for a private meeting. The young assistant arrived, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly. "Dr. Marlowe," Poirot said calmly, gesturing to a chair. "Please sit." Marlowe sat down, his eyes avoiding Poirot's. Poirot began slowly, methodically. "You were very close to Professor Abernathy, Dr. Marlowe. You worked together for many years. You were the one who discovered the inscription on the statuette, was it not?" Marlowe nodded, his jaw tight. "And you believed that he had taken credit for your work," Poirot continued. "You believed that he had stolen your discovery." Marlowe looked down at his hands. "He did," he whispered. "He took my work. He published it as his own." Poirot nodded. "And when he announced the unveiling, you knew he would take full credit. You knew he would publish the discovery with the fragment of papyrus that was yours." Marlowe's head snapped up. "It wasn't just the fragment," he said, his voice rising. "It was the entire discovery. The inscription, the ritual text, it was mine." He took it all. Poirot leaned forward. "So you decided to stop him. You decided to silence him. You planned the murder." Marlowe's face crumpled. "I didn't want to kill him," he said, his voice thick with tears. "I just wanted him to stop, to admit that it was my work. But when I saw him standing there, so confident, so sure of himself, I knew I had to make him pay." Poirot nodded slowly. "You placed the scorpion under the table. You used the venom to deliver the poison. You made it look like a natural accident." Marlowe looked up, his eyes filled with anguish. "I didn't want anyone to know. I just wanted it to look like an accident. I thought no one would suspect." Poirot's voice was gentle but firm. "But the little grey cells see everything. The adhesive on Abernathy's sleeve, it was used to secure the device that delivered the venom. The footprint in the sand, it was made by the same person who wore the cufflink. The missing fragment of papyrus, it was taken by you to prevent him from publishing the full text." He paused, then added, "You were wrong, Dr. Marlowe. The hunger for recognition is not worth a life. It is a ruinous force. And it led you to commit a terrible crime." Marlowe buried his face in his hands. "I know," he whispered. "I know now. I was so angry. I thought he had stolen my life." Poirot stood up slowly. "The truth is always revealed, Dr. Marlowe. The little grey cells do not lie, and the truth is that you killed Professor Abernathy because you believed he had stolen your work. But the truth is also that you were wrong. The work was yours, and it will be recognized." He turned to Japp, who had been standing silently in the corner. "Inspector, I believe it is time to arrest Dr. Marlowe." Japp nodded, his expression grim. "Yes, Poirot. I'll take him in." Marlowe looked up, his eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." Poirot placed a hand on his shoulder. "The little grey cells have shown us the truth, Dr. Marlowe. Now you must face the consequences." Chapter 14. Confrontation and Confession. The following evening Poirot gathered everyone in the main tent, the guests, the dig team, Japp and Hastings. The air was thick with tension, a palpable sense of anticipation. Poirot stood before them, his posture perfect, his eyes calm and steady. He did not look at Marlowe, who stood near the back of the tent, his face pale and drawn. "Friends," Poirot began, his voice clear and resonant in the quiet tent, "we have all gathered here tonight to discuss the events of the past few days. The death of Professor Percival Abernathy, a man who was, I am sure, beloved by many." He paused, letting the words sink in. "We were told it was a scorpion sting. An unfortunate accident, but I have learned otherwise. The truth is far more complex and far more tragic. He turned to Marlowe. Dr. Felix Marlowe, you have been under suspicion for some time, and now the truth must be revealed. Marlowe flinched, but he did not look away. Poirot began to speak, his voice calm but firm. You believed, Dr. Marlowe, that Professor Abernathy had stolen your work, that he had taken credit for the discovery of the inscription on the statuette and the ritual text on the papyrus fragment. You were angry, deeply, profoundly angry. He paused, his gaze fixed on Marlowe. You believed that Abernathy had taken your life's work, your reputation, your very identity, and when he announced the unveiling with full credit, you decided to stop him, not with words, but with action. Marlowe's face was ashen. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Poirot continued. You planned the murder. You knew exactly where to place the scorpion under the table. You used a device, perhaps a small hypodermic needle disguised as a bottle stopper or a pen, to deliver the venom. The puncture wound was clean, precise. It was not caused by a scorpion. It was caused by your weapon. He turned to Jab. Inspector, the medical report confirms that the venom was delivered rapidly, without a stinger. The wound was too clean for a scorpion sting. He turned back to Marlowe. You placed the scorpion after the injection to create the illusion of an accident. You hoped that no one would suspect. But the little grey cells do not lie, Dr. Marlowe. They see every detail, however small. Poirot gestured to the group. The adhesive on Abernathy's sleeve, it was used to secure the device. The footprint in the sand, it was made by the same person who wore the cufflink. The missing fragment of papyrus, it was taken by you to prevent him from publishing the full text. He paused, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You believed that he had stolen your work. But the truth is that you were wrong. The discovery was yours, and it will be recognized. But the price you paid, it was too high. Marlowe's shoulders slumped. He looked at Poirot, his eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry, he whispered. I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted him to stop, to admit that it was my work. Poirot nodded slowly. The hunger for recognition is a powerful force, Dr. Marlowe. It can blind a man to the consequences of his actions, but the little grey cells remind us that justice must be served, even when the truth is hidden in the smallest details. Jap stepped forward. Dr. Marlowe, he said, his voice firm but not unkind, you are under arrest for the murder of Professor Percival Abernathy. Marlowe didn't resist. He simply nodded, his face pale and resigned. I understand, he whispered. As Jap led him away, the tent was silent. The guests looked at each other, their expressions a mixture of shock, sadness, and relief. The mystery was solved. Chapter 15. Aftermath and Reflection. The desert night was cool, a welcome relief from the oppressive heat of the day. Poirot and I sat on the edge of the camp, looking out at the pyramids, their ancient forms silhouetted against the starry sky. It is a tragedy, Poirot said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. A man driven to commit murder by a hunger for recognition that he believed had been stolen from him. Chair, I nodded. He was wrong, Poirot. The discovery was his. Abernathy had no right to take it. Poirot sighed. Yes, but the truth is not always what we believe it to be. Marlowe believed he had been wronged, and in that moment of belief he committed a terrible act. The little grey cells showed us the truth, but they could not change the pain that led him there. He turned to me, his eyes thoughtful. The human heart is a complex thing, Hastings. It can be filled with ambition, pride, and a desire for recognition. And sometimes that desire becomes so strong that it blinds us to the consequences of our actions. We see only the wrong done to us, not the wrong we are about to do. I looked at him, remembering the look on Marlowe's face as he confessed, the despair, the regret. He was sorry, Poirot. He realized what he had done. Poirot nodded. Yes, and that is the most tragic part of all. He realized too late. The hunger for recognition can be a ruinous force. It can destroy not only the life of the one who seeks it, but the lives of others as well. He fell silent for a moment, gazing at the pyramids. But the little grey cells, he added softly, they remind us that truth will always be revealed. The smallest detail, the most overlooked clue, they all lead to the truth. And justice, though it may take time, will always find its way. I looked at him, my friend, the man who saw what others could not. You did it again, Poirot. You uncovered the truth beneath the desert sun. He smiled, a small, melancholy smile. It is not I who uncovered the truth, Hastings. It is the little grey cells. They are always working, even when we cannot see them. He stood up slowly, his posture perfect. The night is young, and there is still much to be done. Justice has been served, but the little grey cells will keep working, always. As we walked back towards the camp, the desert stars glittering above us, I thought of Marlowe's words, "I didn't mean to kill him," and Poirot's quiet wisdom, "The hunger for recognition is a ruinous force." It was a truth as old as time, as timeless as the pyramids themselves, and in the end, it was the little grey cells that had unveiled it, just as they always did.